Welcome. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a real treat for me, and it's a little different than a lot of the events I get the chance to do here, because normally the conversation I'm having is with somebody I've just recently met. This really is about Tom tonight, but I'm going to start with a little story that back in 1981, I found myself in the West Wing of the White House running the Office of Cabinet Affairs as an assistant to President Reagan. And one of the things we did in that office was establish a contact person, a liaison, if you will, with every department and agency so that the White House could get information out and back efficiently to this office I ran. And we set it up right away in the beginning. And early on, one of my little staff meetings, I had a small staff, I asked how we were doing, were we getting everything in place, how was it running? And they said, we're there, we're pretty much there, everybody's got the liaison set up. But the very best one was at the Department of Commerce, where Secretary Malcolm Baldrige was the cabinet officer. And he's passed on, but he was a fantastic individual. Didn't surprise me that it would be a good office. I said, well, what's different about it? What makes it work so well? And they said, well, it's really run by this young guy. He's just really a good guy. He just gets it. He gets things done. That young guy is Tom Collamore. Please welcome him tonight.
Not so young anymore.
It's hard to believe. I know it's hard to believe. It's so it really is kind of fun. And if we go on past 2 hours telling stories, you let us know. No, it won't be that long. But we've been through a lot. We've been friends since 1981. We've been colleagues off and on in government and in private business, in nonprofit organizations, and that sort of thing. But when Tom told me he was working on this book as a co-author with another friend, Jean Beaker, I just thought fantastic, because we benefited so much in all that we did while we were in government with the advancement in women that were out around the country, literally around the world, helping, for me, Vice President George H.W. Bush, but really who helped presidents of both parties, vice presidents, first ladies. And they have incredible stories, and they tell them when they're together, and they tell them to a few of us when we see them. But most of them are untold, and so this book kind of cracks that open. So Tom, in addition to welcoming you, we're going to talk about the book, but I like to start with, so how did this young guy get to the Department of Commerce in 1981? What was that path that got you into government?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be at the Avalon. This is such a great institution of Easton, and it's a thrill to be here with you, an old friend, as you said, of long standing. I don't really want to count the years, but anyway. Well, it's interesting. I actually write about how I got there in the beginning of the book. And I was a young college student volunteering for the George Bush for President campaign in Connecticut in 1979, 1980. The chairman of that campaign in Connecticut was a fellow you just mentioned, Malcolm Baldrige. See how things kind of end up getting connected. And my job was to plan Ambassador Bush's visits for campaign appearances. And as things turned out, the race that year in 1980 came down to Reagan and Bush. They were the last two men standing. And Connecticut was one of Ambassador Bush's 5, I think it was, home states. Kind of an interesting way to politic. He claimed several, born in Massachusetts and raised in Connecticut, summered in Maine, lived in Texas, on and on, but it's all good. But the Connecticut primary was, do or die. Win the primary or you got to get out. And so he came to Connecticut to campaign for a week like he was running for statewide office. I rented a Winnebago, and we were going to take him around the state like he was just hitting the shoe leather and going to every event we could come up with. Well, he had just gotten Secret Service protection the week before because he'd done well, obviously. And the agents looked at this idea and said, no, we don't drive Winnebagos, we're not doing that. And the campaign leadership, this is all we got left, we're doing this. And this kid here is going to drive it. And they said, well, what have you, what's your experience with, oh, no, I've been doing this a long time. What am I, 19 or something? I've been doing this a long time. And, I had never driven the darn thing in my life, right? And we're rolling out of the first parking lot, and there's an agent in the right seat next to me, and I hear him say into the microphone for the protective detail, "So far, so good." So we won the primary, and fast forward to Detroit and the convention, and Bush is named vice president on the ticket. We win the election. I'm going to go to law school, and the phone rings in my dormitory, and it's Mr. Baldridge saying, "Hey, I just got named to Reagan's cabinet, and I don't know anything about Washington, and neither do you. Why don't you defer law school, and let's go figure it out together?" Well, that was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly for all of us. So you roll the clock forward a little further to 1985. Reagan Bush win the re-election in 84. I get asked to be chief of staff to Vice President Bush, and I need to build a staff because there really is quite a bit of turnover. And in addition, the second term is not going to look a lot like the first term. The second term, not only is George Bush going to support the president as he did, that job number one, be ready if needed, but he's clearly going to run for president. And that means a lot of travel. That means a lot of arrangements. And so the office inside the office, the office in the vice president's office that coordinated pretty much everything that flowed to the vice president and out, and a lot of other things, needed somebody who really understood how this all worked. And Tom came over to take that job on, and then traveled most of the time. And if I wasn't traveling, he was traveling, but most of the time we were traveling together. And over the 4-year period of time, we went to over 60 countries, every state in the nation multiple times. And on every single trip, when we landed, there were advance teams there. They went out in advance of our visit. They worked on that. One day, head of advance, Dave Ryder, we had a national tour, sort of campaign related, and then we were headed to the Middle East and some other countries. And he came to me and he said, today, I just added it up. Today, we actually have 100 individuals doing advance work for George Bush somewhere in the world. So the order of magnitude gets pretty large. But that experience, I know, is what really introduced you to the world of advance.
It is. And the idea behind this book, frankly, all of those advance people are trained to operate in the shadows behind the curtain. They're not supposed to be in the photo op. They're not supposed to get any public credit for what they're doing. They're just sort of supposed to seamlessly make it all look perfect. And with the passage of time, they're now able to tell their stories. So we have 96 contributors to this book who I consider sort of unsung heroes, who are now telling their stories that they're proud of and their families can be proud of. And it's a bipartisan book. The earliest story in this book is 1960. If you can believe it, we found the advance man, who's now in his late 90s, who took Lyndon Johnson to Boston just after Labor Day in 1960, after he'd been named to the ticket with Kennedy. Can you imagine? It's like going behind enemy lines. And so he took Johnson to Boston basically so Johnson could prove he was worthy of their guy. And he passed that test with flying colors, and it really helped springboard the fall race for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket. But the detail in that, and I love the evolution of advance. I met a gentleman here who did advance for Carter. The evolution over the years of the complexity of the craft is sort of highlighted in the book as well. Here's one guy. He went to Boston. He found the cars for the motorcade. By the way, there was no Secret Service for the majority leader of the Senate and vice presidential nominee. So, he set the whole thing up, got the hotel lined up, printed the leaflets, did the whole 9 yards, one guy. And you fast forward to the complexity of an international trip today, for instance, with scores of people working on every facet. But as I say, 1960 through Obama, 2016. So almost 60 years of presidential history. I tell my friends, this is a really sneaky way to get young people to learn a little something about recent history. Because, as you know, young people aren't big on reading anymore. But this book is a great, I think, educational tool for what's happened in our country on the presidential politics level from 1960 to almost current day.
So go back. You raise an interesting question or point. Go back and describe how you actually found all of these individuals who then contributed.
So my co-author is a woman named Jean Beaker. She's from Houston. And she was George H.W. Bush's chief of staff for the 25 years he was in retirement after the presidency. So when you have that job, you get to know all the other chiefs of staff of former presidents and heads of library foundations. And so she was a huge help in connecting. And then I've been involved in George H.W. Bush's presidential library since it was built shortly after his presidency, so for 35 years or so. So I too knew a lot of those people and was friends with a lot of old advanced people from Reagan and Ford and even Nixon, and we've got stories in here from Bob Dole and others. So where were we short? We were a little short on the Democrat side. But Jean was very good friends with the woman who runs the Clinton Foundation, and Bill Clinton, as you may remember, became very close friends with George Bush 41 in retirement. And as they say, eventually it felt like Bill Clinton was George Bush's long-lost younger brother, so we were fine on Clinton. We found the head of Obama world, if you will, through some connections, and she convened a Zoom call with all of the top advanced people. Basically, everybody bought in. They loved the idea of being able to tell these stories in a bipartisan way. So.
And the libraries, the presidential libraries have gotten into this too, haven't they?
The libraries were great connectors. There's several pages of pictures in here. I think every one but one maybe came from a presidential library. And they also helped us find people. That's the biggest problem now is, if people are living in plain sight, but they're not easy to find sometimes. So they were very helpful.
So he probably won't tell you this, but he actually had kind of a trifecta last week. The LBJ Library live, the George H.W. Bush Library in Texas live, and the Reagan Library in a Zoom call, right? All in 1 week.
3 in 1.
3 in 1.
Well, we go to Carter in a couple of weeks and Clinton in about a month. So yeah, we're making the circuit.
So it's really great to see. And at the Bush Library, you actually were joined by 3 of the advanced people, and my guess is that more are going to come out. I think they're kind of enjoying this moment.
It's a lot of fun. So at the Bush Library in College Station, we had 3 folks who live in Texas come join us, who are contributors to the book, and they told their stories in person. And it was great. It was great for them, and it was great for the audience to sort of see some of these folks in action. We did the same thing on this Zoom call with the Reagan people. I think it's getting posted tonight, actually. And there were some alumni on there who were in the book, and we talked about them as well. We're going to talk about some of them in a little bit as well.
Yeah, Tom has pictures, so I want to go to the pictures. We're actually also going to save some time for questions, so you get a chance to ask questions. I go back when I think about this to something we did right at the beginning in 1985, when we both ended up in the vice president's office. We actually had kind of a clinic for advanced people, and we got the people who really wanted to spend most of their time either paid. A few were paid. Most of them were coming from other parts of the government or volunteering. And we had a few days to sort of walk them through what we wanted them to do. And the theory was that for most people, in the course of our running around the country, by the way, in the midterm elections of 1986, George Bush traveled as much as he did in his presidential election in 1988. So we were on the road a lot. But most people, when they meet somebody from the office of the vice president or the office of the president, they're meeting an advanced person. So we wanted them to be the good ambassador. And the image I always remember is showing them, what can go wrong. And there's a podium, and Tom will talk about the podiums that are available for presidents and vice presidents. But the advanced person kind of panicked because he needed to get the vice presidential seal on the podium, and he didn't have any means of hooking it up, so he got a bunch of duct tape and he taped it up there. Worked perfectly. It sat there, I'm sure, for a couple hours until the vice president came in and the press lights came on and the dark podium began heating up. And then as the vice president spoke, the emblem went bloop, bloop, bloop. Nobody heard what the vice president said that day. So there's an art to this. I think we should maybe go to some of your pictures, and that'll lead us into some more stories.
Yeah, you reminded me of one thing that I want to say. You have an old friend, Ron Walker, who And Ron was the head of advance for President Nixon and actually established the first office of presidential advance in the White House. It used to be that all the advance folks were embedded in the federal agencies and they had fake jobs. You know, they were special assistant to somebody at the Department of the Interior. Well, they didn't even know how to find the Department of the Interior. They were on the payroll of Interior, but they worked out of the executive office building. And President Nixon asked Ron Walker to actually establish the first office. And it was Ron, which you reminded me, who wrote the first manual of advance and how to do advance. And the manual we did in 1986 was a riff off of Ron's original manual. And in fact, James Carville bragged about stealing that manual in 1992 for the Clinton campaign against George Bush.
So I have got to tell one story about Ron Walker, because he took this very seriously. Anybody who knows Ron, he was very serious about it. But they were on an advance trip. I've heard China and I've heard Russia. I think it may have been it was Moscow or Russia.
It's in the book.
It's in the book. And they knew they were being listened to. They were bugged. They knew the rooms were bugged. And so one night, the advance team, this is before the president got there, and they were arguing, of course, with their hosts all the time, all day long. They decide one night in the building they're in, they're going to find the bugs. So they begin looking into the pictures, the lamps, all the likely places, and some guy pulls back a carpet and he says, "I've got it. I've got it." And they get down on the floor, there's a box, and there's some device that you unscrew, and he starts unscrewing it. He gets it unscrewed, and there is an enormous crash below. Turns out he's unscrewed the chandelier. Which they quickly screwed it back together, put the carpet back, and never told the story. But it's in the book.
It's legendary. It's legendary. Well, do you want me to tell a couple?
Yeah, let's take a look.
Well,
at
we have video. No video.
Oh,
We
video.
have pictures. Here we go.
Okay.
Well, this is a pretty iconic picture. This is President Reagan, of course, speaking at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, just a few hundred feet short of communist East Berlin and the Berlin Wall, of course. So this didn't happen by accident. Jim Hooley, who was the head of advance for President Reagan, who unfortunately passed away about a week ago, but an old friend of Craig's as well, was on what's called the pre-advance trip for this visit. And he was looking out the window at the Reichstag, which is where the embassy and the host government wanted President Reagan to give this speech. They wanted him to speak indoors, much safer, easier to secure, easier to build the audience, all those things. And he was looking out the window, and he saw the Brandenburg Gate, and he said, "Well, that's crazy. There's the visual right there. That's what we want to have behind the president." And so he pushed to move the venue outside, and so there's President Reagan behind bulletproof glass, but there are speakers you can't see aimed at East Berlin so that the people of East Berlin could hear the president. They had heard he was coming because American operatives made sure they knew he was coming. You know, this is a great example of how the vision of an advance team can take a really good speech with an interesting message and turn it into an historic and iconic event. I mean, we all can remember Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But I don't think it would have had the same effect in an indoor speech at the Reichstag. So I like this as an example of how powerful an impact an advance team can have on an event and a moment in history.
So I'm going to take that and tell a story about another outdoor event that for some of us was iconic and unfortunately memorable. When in Texas, the Vice President and Mrs. Bush were in Austin for some sort of anniversary of celebration of Texas statehood or something. And the state, if you've been to their state capitol, there's a beautiful long lawn area, and the crowd was large. We were up on steps. We'd been in the holding area in the Capitol, and we'd come out, and we were up on the steps, and you know, there's fairly carefully orchestrated event. And Mrs. Bush, Barbara Bush's role was to, upon cue, take a sword. It was kind of like a huge, longest sword, saber you've ever seen. Take a sword from a military person, and as she looked out of the crowd, she gets the sword, and then she turns around, and she's supposed to slice into the cake, which is part of the anniversary. And of course, it's a red, white, and blue cake. As this starts to happen, the head of our advanced team, also Dave Ryder, says to me, "Oh, I forgot to tell you something." Part of my job was, just because lots of things happen, was to make sure I knew what was supposed to happen so that before the bushes went out, I could just remind them the scenario. He said, "I forgot to tell you something." I said, "What was that?" He said, "Well, there's gonna be 4 F-16s doing a flyover." I said, "Oh, really? When's that going to occur?" He says, "It's about now." She says her back is to the crowd. She slices into the cake. The flyby occurs, which is a deafening roar of 4 F-16s. She pulls the knife out, spins around, has a horrible, god-awful look on her face, and the knife is covered in red frosting. We managed to make the front page of the newspaper the next day.
Great photo.
And the directions to the advanced staff were run around the hotel and pick up every blessed newspaper you could find. It still didn't work, but we didn't lose our jobs. But so it doesn't always work out the way you plan.
Well, speaking of things that can go wrong, this is known as the Purple Hat speech. There's the 6'2" President of the United States and the 5'3" Queen of England. And that's the Blue Goose. Craig mentioned the presidential podium earlier. And every president gets the Blue Goose made to their specifications so that it's the right height and all that sort of thing. And so this one was perfect for President Bush. And what normally happens is some local personage or VIP introduces the president, and the president comes up to the podium and he kicks in a 1-foot built-in step stool at the bottom of the podium. And he just sort of naturally kicks it in, and then everything's seamless, and the introducer looked good and the president looks good. Well, when there's a state arrival ceremony, the president introduces the guest of honor. So nobody thought about, maybe we need to have someone pull the step stool out for the queen. So that didn't happen. Mrs. Bush wrote about this in her memoirs because she was sitting down front. She couldn't literally see the queen. This is actually a generous picture of this moment. And it was beamed all around the world, quite embarrassing for the White House, still talked about to this day. And the queen, God bless her, she had a great sense of humor. So the next day she had a joint session of Congress, and she goes up to the House and literally brings the House down with her opening line, which is, "Well, I do hope you can all see me today from where you are." But the advanced man never lived this down. He's still around, a guy named Gordon James, great guy. And it wasn't really his fault. No one thought it through. But it was in the New York Times obit for the chief of protocol, Joseph Werner Reed, a very proper gentleman who was he took the blame for this. But anyway, it was not a good day for the advanced team.
That's a good one. Go to the next one. I know it's coming.
Well, yeah, here's another one. So it's our friend Bob Dole, and he's running for president in 1988. And Bob Dole was someone who liked to make his own decisions, and sometimes that could work against you. There's a reason you have a staff sort of planning things. But he got a call. They were campaigning in Florida from a friend involved in the building of Universal Studios. This is 1988. And they're building Universal Studios in Orlando. And they said, "Look, we've got the whole team there. We want to welcome you. We're going to have press. It's going to be great. Just come." And so Dole gets off the phone. He said, "We're going to go to Universal Studios this afternoon. Make it work." And his lead advance guy, Mike Lake, who writes the story in the book, says, "Well, sir, can we do that tomorrow? I mean, let's check this out. Let's make sure we're in good." No, my guy said it's going to be great. We're going to go. So they get there. There is no one there except this greeting party. Frankenstein, Charlie Chaplin, Mae West isn't in this picture, but this is the greeting party. Dole sees this, and there's a huge press pool there, like 40 press, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm going to introduce you to some of my future cabinet members. Let's go." So the real kicker is, on that same day, that same afternoon, he fired the 3 top lieutenants in his campaign. And so this is the picture on the front of the New York Times and many other papers the next day saying, Dole shakes up campaign staff. And this is the picture. So this was not a good day for the advance team. Although, honestly, it wasn't their fault, but they get the credit.
So I'll add to one more Bob Dole story, which there's a number, but so we were in New Hampshire, and if you remember in 1988, Bush and Dole were campaigning in these primaries, and actually Bush had come in third in Iowa, and it really made New Hampshire kind of make or break for us, and it was extremely close, but Vice President Bush won, and and Tom Brokaw of NBC News, if I'm recalling the correspondent correctly, that's right, so offered an interview to Bush, and they clearly offered an interview to Dole. Now, there's a group of advance people called Press Advance, and they work with the press, and they're supposed to make sure you know what's going to happen, what the producer's planning, how this is going to go. I actually think both Bush and Dole were surprised because when they cut to the interview, the image was both Dole and Bush, and then Tom Brokaw from NBC News. And Dole is realizing he's losing or has lost, and Bush hadn't sewn it up. We had to go to South Carolina. We had the other states to do, but it certainly was, winning was a whole lot better than losing. And a question came to Dole about what he would say, what he wanted to say to George Bush. And at that moment he said, well, you can stop lying about my record. That was the line that really probably ended Bob Dole's campaign, because the attitude that showed through and the coarseness was something that nobody would forget. You were there, you remember?
I walked out of the studio with the vice president. He didn't hear it. And he said, what did he just say?
Really?
And I told him, and he said, we'll see how that works out. He knew right away that was not a good look for Senator Dole. Well, we also, in the book, we have some rather poignant stories. We have the advance person who was called at the last second, of course, to go to Newtown, Connecticut, and advance President Obama to go console the families of the horrible shooting incident there. And we also have the gentleman who was the director of advance and was on Air Force One on 9/11 and was with the president for the ensuing 3 days or so, a fellow named Brian Montgomery, who Craig and I know very well. He'd been an advance man in Bush world for many years. And the 9/11 story is compelling for a few reasons, I think. I mean, it's, of course, well written, and all of us who lived through it have our own memories of it. And Brian walks us through the morning hours where they're hearing about the planes hitting and, giving Andy Card the information about the second plane and him going in the classroom, and President Bush speaking at the school before they rushed to Air Force One and literally take off like they're in F-16, and hopscotching to a couple of Air Force bases and eventually getting back to Washington so he could address the nation from the Oval Office. And then the following day, going to the Pentagon to advance that, to see the damage there, and then bring the president over there, and then to the National Cathedral for a stirring national service of mourning. And then, sort of the toughest of all, going to Ground Zero, and then consoling the families at the convention center of the missing police and firemen afterwards. But Brian takes us through that step by step, and I really commend that essay to you. It's not that long, but it really captures, I think, what everyone was feeling at the time. But he ends it this way. He gets home. He's been on the road now nonstop for 3 or 4 days, and he's getting undressed in his bedroom in Alexandria, Virginia, and he looks down at his dress shoes, and they're covered in white paste from Ground Zero. And he can't bring himself. He doesn't really know what to do with them. He's like, I can't clean these off. I mean, what this signifies. And so he puts them in a plastic bag, and the next day he puts them in a plastic container in his closet, and 25 years later they're still there. It's quite a story. It's quite a story.
So I want to give you one back, a little lighter, not as meaningful, but a little lighter. So life on the road, for Tom and me was always an adventure. And one of the things in the campaign that we were dealing with was we had a pretty tight operation on the airplane. And we'd all been together for 3.5 years. It's 1988. We're going all over the country, multiple cities every day, working with Secret Service, White House Communications, the advanced people, the local people. So we had a pretty tight ship. But back in Washington, D.C., we had this behemoth that was the campaign headquarters, where all knowledge would rest. And they would from time to time send out things they wanted in the speech. They would also get draft speeches, and they would send comments back. One of the things you do when you're on the road like that is much of the speech, honestly, every day is kind of common, but the candidate, the vice president in this case, would insert things that day, and that would be the news of the day. So we were, wherever we were, and I forget, wherever we were, we had Peggy Noonan with us. Now, Tom and I are huge fans of Peggy Noonan. She's a dear friend to this day, and she made an enormous difference in the campaign, and she had the ability to speak with George Bush at great length and really understand what he wanted to communicate and then give it back to him in a slightly more eloquent speech, but it matched him, it fit him. She really wrote for him. She also wrote for Ronald Reagan, but the work she did for him, she wrote for him. And for some reason, she had concluded that a delicate social issue might be somehow inserted into this speech. It had to do with right to life. Now, Tom and I knew this wasn't going to stay on the speech. We saw it, but it had gone back to headquarters. Oh my God, we got these calls, people. We said, just don't worry. It was at night. We'd been going all day. So I forget what I was doing, but Tom came down the hall and said to me, I think you better come down to Peggy's room. I said, what's going on? He said, just come on down. I can hear the screaming before I get there. I would say it resembled what a drunken sailor might be like, but I think that might not be fair to drunken sailors. Peggy is standing on the bed, jumping up and down, cursing out every staff person within sight. It was quite a scene. And because, she said, those idiots back there, they want to change this language. I'm not changing one word. And I talked with the vice president about it. I said, oh, really? Okay. I said, well, let's clear the room. Peggy, why don't we sit in the chairs? And I explained as best I could that I understood what she was trying to do, and I understood that the conversation they had gave her cause to think that maybe a slightly different version on this sensitive issue could be uttered. But I said, here's what I know for sure. About this issue, about other sensitive issues around Contra, there are a few. If you say exactly the same thing anytime you are in a situation where you're speaking on a particular topic, if you say exactly the same thing, it's not news. The press, and we had a wonderful relationship with them, but they are trained to look for variants and variations. So if you say just a little bit, something a little bit different, they go write a huge story that you've changed your position. And on social issues, it's a huge story. And I said, Peggy, what you don't really want it to do is have us spend the next week trying to explain what this means, because we're set. We have a position. He has a position. Whether you like it or I like it, it's his position. Just leave it. We got to leave it alone. Then she said, okay. And Tom took the speech in, and it was out.
Drama. There's always a little drama.
And you were there more than once. I mean, we had all kinds of things coming to us. The advance people were supposed to make sure the police event that the vice president was surrounded by cops. Well, that was helpful.
Yeah.
He actually would post these messages on the inside of the airplane.
We had a wall of fame on the side of the plane of absurd instructions from headquarters that were to be ignored at all costs. And then if some big shot campaign official came on the plane, we had to hide them all, So,
Okay,
all right.
you got another one in
Oh,
there?
I got, well,
A couple more?
since you're here, I do have a couple that involve you, which is. So this is Vice President Bush and Solidarity leader Lech Walesa in Warsaw. But this is an interesting picture because this picture happens while Poland is still under communist rule as part of the behind the Iron Curtain under a lovely gentleman named General Jaruzelski. And the whole purpose of this visit was for Vice President Bush, at President Reagan's request, to convey to the people of Poland that America had their back. Those in Poland who sought freedom and democracy, that we had their back. We saw what was hopefully coming, and we would be there for them. That's not easy to do when you're operating in a country where every move is monitored by the secret police and everything is clamped down. You can't tell, but there's 20,000 people on the other side of that street, none of whom were invited to this event or the host government was aware they were coming. So we're talking about a very complex job by the advance team to let it be known that this event was going to happen. And to do this, they had to sneak Lech Walesa in the guest house where Bush was staying, sneak him into the motorcade, and take him to this church. But maybe I should let you tell a little bit of that since you were in the middle of it and almost got yourself kicked out of Poland.
Literally in the middle of it. Well, so let me go back just quickly to say that after the re-election in '84, or after the midterms, I'm sorry, Vice President Bush felt that there was a real opportunity to move things forward more quickly in Poland, and he and the president actually discussed that, and they discussed it initially as an idea that maybe President Reagan would go. That wasn't really in the cards, so that's when President Reagan said, "No, you go," and President Reagan let up on some of the sanctions that have been imposed on Poland, sending a very significant signal not only to Poland but to the region. And then the next thing that happens is suddenly the Vice President of the United States is going to go. So it's exactly as Tom describes it. We had our advance teams over there. They called, John Keller, who headed the advance team, called while he was doing the pre-advance, and among other things said, we have an opportunity, I think. They're willing to let the Vice President address the nation using their national television studio. But there's two options. One is to go to the studio and tape it, which would fit our schedule more easily. And the other one is to do it live. I said, do it live. I said, this is like, if you're ever interviewed by the media, you don't want them to cut it up, you want to go live and they broadcast the whole thing. So I said, try to get it live, so we'll figure out the schedule. So they agreed to it, they locked into it. So on during the day of speech was going to be on an evening, and during the day, we have this visit to this church. It's a very solemn occasion in many ways, and it's very kind of small. You might have more details on this, but anyway, the Vice President and Lech Walesa go into the church. They're kind of hidden from view, and the exit plan has them sort of near the altar, and then coming down a center aisle, and turning left and going out to the vehicles. Well, the advance team, the night before, having ordered up a sound system, put it on an Air Force plane, and flown it in, started work about midnight, and set up an entire sound system on this balcony, overlooking the crowd of 20,000 people, or overlooking the crowd we hoped would be large, turned out to be larger than we thought, and a total surprise to the Polish government. So we told the Vice President, who is wonderful in so many ways, and he's a respecter of authority. And so if the host government says, we're going to walk down the aisle, turn left, go to the cars, he's inclined to do that. We said, no, actually, we're not going to tell him, but we're going to walk down the aisle, and you and your Secret Service detail are going to peel off to the right. And an advanced person will be there. There's a little small stairway, and you'll go up the stairway with Lech Walesa, and this is the shot they got. It all sounded pretty reasonable. There actually, in the process of writing this book, Tom and I went back and forth a little bit with some of the advance guys, because the advance guys thought not even the Secret Service knew, and I said, well, no, there I kind of draw the line. We are there, we are protecting the man's life. So the head of his detail knew what we were going to do, because I told him. But turns out he hadn't told some of his agents on the ground, which got them upset. But in this case, sometimes the most important qualification for my job was size. So I was right behind the vice president-elect Valesso. I just moved aside, let the Secret Service detail go in front of me, and as everybody turned left, our group turned right, and then I kind of held my ground enough to get everybody to the stairway, which was so small, when I stood in the stairway, nobody could get by me. So they kept pounding on my back to, what's going on, which gave the vice president-elect Valesso a chance to get up and make this statement. I'm pretty accurate, right?
You're on spot. I would say you're probably lowballing the amount of grief that our team took from the agents and the Polish authorities, who never forgave us, I don't think, for that little trick.
So for that stunt, and for some of the things we did, like have Valesso with us, we finished this little stunt. We go back and we have a reception at the American Embassy for the community reception, which involves both Americans as well as our Polish hosts. And during that event, we didn't have an ambassador. It was charge d'affaires. So he played the role of ambassador, which is of equal importance, and was our representative there, America's representative there. And he was, of course, he knew he was in for grief. He didn't put up with a lot. And all day long, the Polish authorities were asking for the text of the vice president's remarks that were going to be aired on their national television station. And all day long, we had not given it to them, knowing that the longer we waited, the more chance we had of actually delivering the speech. Finally, I don't think it was me, but finally, a wise person, probably this guy, gave released the press release, which was a summary or some with some quotes, but we didn't put draft on the press release, so they got that. Soon after getting that, they called the charge and say, get over here with Mr. Fuller to Communist Party headquarters in Poland. It was the darkest, the dankest, the greenest.
Did you go to the dungeon? Were you down in the
dungeon? I felt like I was in a dungeon, and I wasn't sure I was getting out anytime soon. And I'd actually said to the vice president before I left the reception, I don't know how this is going to go. They have problems, but here's the thing. They've agreed to broadcast this live. I'm not sure where I'm going to be when we're supposed to go over there, but I would stick with the advance team and go to the broadcast station as though you're going to give the broadcast, and let's hope it all works out, and if it doesn't, it's on them, but that's the plan. He goes, okay, that sounds good to me. So off I go. And I met with the three grumpiest, unhappiest people I've ever seen, who started speaking Polish, and our ambassador understood, and I said, but guys, let's use English. I mean, this isn't going to work if we're translating. And basically, the bottom line was they had all kinds. They marked up they were mad that we released the press release, which actually we hadn't done. They got the speech. They started marking up the speech. And I have great respect for the charge because I knew what he was going to go through when we left. So he said something like, "Well, let's see if we can work with, this first paragraph." At which point I said, "I'm sorry, this meeting has to come to a conclusion." I said, it won't be good for us, but it won't be good for you if the story comes out that the vice president was invited to address your nation and you wanted to edit his speech. And these guys looked at me and they kind of knew it was right, but they were not happy, at which point they stood up and just dismissed us.
He gave the speech.
Well, so I go back to the guest house. Vice President is resting in bed. He goes, how'd it go? I said, just fine, sir. He said, well, do we make any changes? I said, no, we're not making any changes. And if anybody asks you to make changes, don't make any changes. He gave the speech. It aired as he delivered it. And later that night at a dinner, these three grumpy guys were there. And they came up and basically, in their own way, said, well, we had to try.
Oh, something else. All right, I got one more.
Okay.
I got one more. Most importantly, I know we're running out of time. Does anybody recognize that guy on the far right? It's a slightly younger Craig Fuller. I should let you tell this one too, but we're on an active taxiway in St. Louis, Missouri. We've been informed that Air Force Two has a hydraulic problem. We're supposed to go to Minneapolis to give a speech. It's a speech which Craig might inform you more about that he really wanted to give, even though no one thought he should. And we really didn't purposely screw up the hydraulic thing, although it might not have been a bad idea.
And we probably were accused of it.
But there's our head of advance on the left trying to figure out what we're going to do. There's me offering no value at all. And the vice president looking off saying, where did I get these guys?
Was that Ralph? Is that our secret?
No, it's a different agent. That's an agent. But Craig, tell us the quick version of what happened here.
Okay, the quick version, then we're going to take some of your questions. The quick version is a very good friend of the vice president's broke through all of our, fences and walls and got through to the vice president and said, he's a wonderful man, by the way, and said, there's an opportunity for you to get in front of students at this huge hall where we give speeches in Minneapolis. And it's going to be a splendid event, George. And Craig Fuller has turned us down twice. At which point the vice president says, well, I don't understand that. And says to me, I really want to do this speech. And I said, sir, we have, around contrary issues, we got a lot of things going on to a college campus where we cannot control who's in the audience and having you give a speech. I just don't think, I am giving the speech. I said, okay. We'll work it out. So no, the entire campaign says, why are we going there? I said, just don't even discuss it. We're going there. So we set up a fundraising event in St. Louis, which is what got us to St. Louis. We had a lovely event, raised some money, did some local events, good night's sleep, get up the next morning, go to the airport. The vice president boards the plane, and the way it works for presidents and vice presidents is when they walk on the plane, the door closes, the engines are running, he sits down, and you taxi out and take off. Well, we didn't taxi out and take off. And the head of advance, I think Dave Ryder again, John Keller. John Keller comes to me and says, the captain needs to talk to you. There is nothing good about that kind of conversation when you're supposed to be taking off. And they knew I was a pilot, so we chatted, and he said, look, we got a problem. We cannot fix the problem, and the part we need isn't in the area. This plane isn't flying anywhere today. And we can get a plane, but it's going to take 4 or 5 hours. Well, in 4 or 5 hours, we're going to miss the speech in Minneapolis. So at which point the vice president, realizing we're not taxiing, comes and says, what's the problem? Or maybe I went back and told him, he said, what's the problem? And I said, well, we have a hydraulic issue. He looks at me and he says, I am going to give that speech. I said, got it. So at that moment, we walked back and we're talking about this. And I think it was Ralph Basham, eventually the head of our detail, who became the head of Secret Service. He comes out, and we're talking about what we're going to do, and I'm standing there looking at a beautiful Beechcraft Hawker business jet parked next to us with its red beacon on, meaning it's powered up, electrically anyway. And it was a charter. And so I said to Ralph Basham, you call the FAA, here's the tail number, you find out whether or not there's any reason that the vice president should not be on that aircraft. He looked at me and he said, what? And I said, well, we have somebody who's intending to be in Minneapolis this afternoon on board, and we need to solve this. I said, I'm going to go talk to the pilot. I go over to the pilot, really neat guy, charter pilot. And I said, I have a request, and it's going to give you a story you can tell for the rest of your life. I said, the vice president of the United States would like to commandeer your aircraft. He looked at me and he goes, what? I said, we're stuck. We got a hydraulic problem. We can't use the aircraft. We got to be in Minneapolis. He said, I love it. He said, if it's okay with my client, let's do it. So we go inside. The client is a banker. Forget which bank, but doesn't matter. But a New York bank. And very nice guy. And of course, we've really screwed his schedule up because there's a ramp hold because Air Force 2 was supposed to be taking off. And I said, I've got a story that you're going to be able to tell if you'll agree to something. And I tell him, and he says, that's amazing. He said, well, frankly, I probably missed my meetings, but my assistant has got to get to Michigan. I said, put her on the plane. That's fine. So a few of us got on this Hawker aircraft that held about, a third of the people, or not even that, of the, we had on Air Force Two. And we flew, and the end of this is that we land, well, not quite the end. The end of this, we land and the advanced guys on the ground are saying, calling the head advanced guy saying, where are you? We don't see Air Force Two. And he said, well, we're taxiing up. He said, we don't see Air Force Two. He said, well, we're taxiing up. Door opens of the Hawker, and out comes the vice president. And then the 30-second finish is, we race over to the university. We get into this packed hall. Vice president's introduced. He starts to speak. The first banner comes down in protest, then the next banner comes down in protest, then 5 people are hauled away. Then he tries to speak again, and then another banner comes down, 5 more people are hauled away. He shouted down, and I'm standing back there, and as he walks out, he looks at me and he goes, don't say a word. Is that the note you want to end on?
Well, it was a moment. I would love some questions if there are questions.
Yeah, let's take some questions. Anybody got yes?
So did you guys have to go through a pre-pub review to ensure there was nothing, classified in what you were giving in the book?
That's a great question. So the question is, did we have to do any sort of pre-publication review to make sure we weren't disclosing any secrets unintentionally? The answer is sort of yes and no. The stories, most of them are old enough that we were in pretty good shape. And both myself and my co-author had worked in government a fairly long time and had a pretty good sense of things. And we had some proofreaders who also had a lot of government experience. There was one story that I was particularly worried about. And interestingly, we have a contributor to the book who had the expertise to vet it for us. His name is Bob Gates, and he used to run the CIA and the Defense Department. So we sent the story to Secretary Gates, and he agreed. There were about 3 things I thought should come out, and he agreed they should come out. So we did do that. We were pretty careful.
You can't tell us what those are here?
It'd be wrong. But and the other thing, not your exact question, but I think the other thing is that advanced people are trained that what happens on the road stays on the road. There's sort of a code of conduct and a code of respecting the people you're working for, that they have a life and you don't disclose certain things. And when we were recruiting people to be contributors, we made it very clear we weren't going to violate those codes either. If you're looking for a gossip book, this isn't it. But I think it does give you a pretty good insight behind the curtain.
If I could, from each of you, have your moment in your political life, a moment or an event that you'll never forget. It's like the number one.
I think winning the election in 1988. I was dead tired, sitting in Houston. I thought he could do it, but I never let myself believe it until the last couple days. And then and actually that morning on election day, we thought the polling showed us ahead, and we thought we were in good shape. And Vice President Bush, soon to be President-elect Bush, asked me if I would co-chair his transition. But we didn't want to talk about it, and so we did. We met every day early usually with somebody from the agency, CIA, for the daily intelligence briefing. So we did that, and then we had this conversation. And I had already said I was going to leave government, so that was. But I agreed to help the chair. But then the early returns began to come in, the exit interviews began to come in, and it was tightening, and everybody got very nervous. But I think winning has a big advantage over the alternative. That was one of them. That was the best one. In some ways, the worst one was I was in the Roosevelt room of the West Wing of the White House when President Reagan got shot, and that whole day, is kind of seared in your memory. It also turned out well, very well, obviously. But there were moments when you just really weren't sure where this was headed. And people were tested, and I think all of us who went through that, there was kind of a special bond, from that moment.
It's hard to top that. There is a section in the book about the Reagan assassination attempt from the perspective of 3 or 4 staffers who hadn't told their stories before. And there's also a great story in there about one of the assassination attempts on President Ford. For me, you took the greatest night, the winning. I'd say the very last day in the White House as vice president, because my job the evening of January 19th, 1989, at about 11 o'clock, was to take the final reading copy of the inaugural address and walk it across the street and leave it on the front table in Blair House so that the president-elect would have the clean copy with all of the edits he had finished that afternoon. And that was sort of my final act. And I went home and I slept for about a day and a half. I didn't even go to the swearing in, but I think that might be it.
There's one more you ought to share another. You got more than that, but one I'll share, which was probably.
This could get boring.
I felt like the most out of place person ever. Kenny Bunkport for George Bush was a very special place. He was there every year of his life, except the year he was flying a torpedo bomber in the Pacific. So it was a place that the family revered, and he wanted me to see it after he'd asked me to be his chief of staff, and I'd become chief of staff. He wanted to get me there to see it, and I think it was April, which is cold up there. And so we fly up on Air Force 2, land at what was then called Pease Air Force Base, drive to the place. He says, "Come on, we're going to go for a walk." Well, I didn't even have any of my luggage. It wasn't in my room, and I'm in a I think sport coat and dress shoes, and he goes in, and the man could change clothes faster than anybody I've ever seen. We needed to actually have 2 Secret Service details because he'd arrive at a hotel room with one detail, and then literally about 8 minutes later he'd come out the door to go jogging, so we had to have a second detail to go jogging. Well, that was my problem. So he arrives, he changes clothes, and in the freezing cold, walking on wet rocks at Kenny Bunkport, I kept thinking, if I just make an idiot out of myself and fall into the ocean, this could be a very short career. Fortunately, I didn't.
It worked out. It worked out. Became a Mainer, sort of. Any other questions?
Okay, let's go. Oh, there's
No
one.
one else has one, I have another.
Sure, fire away.
So what years did you stop working for the government? And then to follow on that would be, whatever that time span was, from the time you started working in advance to the time you ended, were you amazed at the advances or the things that we now know that, gosh, if only we had known that, to do those things back then, we weren't, we didn't know those things needed to be done?
So my time in government reflects Craig's. I was just in it a little longer. I started in 1981 like he did, and was there through 92.
Okay.
To me, the big thing was technology. And you have to, think about it. We were in the middle of a presidential campaign with no iPhone, no BlackBerry, no cell phone.
Yeah.
You lived by fax and hardline phones. Nowadays, if there's a speech, a big speech particularly, it probably gets edited. There's probably like 15 or 20 drafts of the speech, right? Because it's so easy. Back then, there was 1 or maybe 2 drafts. There was the original draft. He'd make his edits. If there was time, you'd have somebody retype some of the cards he used, and you'd take that old white stuff and put it on the press release and type over it. Very different. And the teleprompters were a huge challenge. There's a great teleprompter story in the book. I won't tell it now about Bill Clinton, but I remember a couple of times with then Vice President Bush, he'd make changes on a speech. We were landing, literally the wheels were touching down. He said, "Here," and we're going to the speech site. And I'm sprinting from the motorcade car into the building to find the guy, and I'm dictating the changes. He's typing them in. Bush starts giving the speech. We're editing the speech. We're trying to stay a few pages ahead of where he's speaking. And you think you're sweating bullets on that. So that happened more than once. Not my favorite situation, but anyway.
So my time was January 1981, as Vice President Bush was taking the oath of office to become president. My time in government ended, and I stayed in the Washington area, still helping and still doing things with the family and with him. It's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that I lament now, knowing what I knew then, maybe I'm reversing your question, but is that what I lament is that the security requirements, the relationship with the media has changed so dramatically from what we had. We didn't have the technology is the huge issue, but that was also true for the press. So you'd have a producer traveling with us for NBC, CBS, ABC, CNN. We didn't have Fox then, really. We would work with them to explain what we were trying to do. They would try to sell a story back to New York. New York would then give them, whether they had 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, no minutes. But it was a much more collaborative relationship with the press. More importantly, though, there was the ability for the candidate, even the vice president, to be out among people more. And that's important. They just lose their feel for, what people are feeling. Now, George Bush may have been the best there has been for somebody who stayed in touch. He stayed in touch with tons of people. In fact, he would sit in holding rooms and say, "Give me the phone book." And I said, "What?" He goes, "Well, we're in Cleveland. I know people in Cleveland. He'd open the phone book and start calling people." I said to Lee Atwater, our campaign chairman, "There's probably a more efficient way. Why don't you just give us a list of the people you should call when he's in these cities?" But it's that human touch. I met a guy in New Hampshire when we were campaigning, and we were at an event, and he had a Kemp button on, a Dole button on, a Bush button on, and he came up to visit with me, and I said, "So, I'm glad you have a Bush button." I said, "I see you got some others." I said, "Have you made up your mind?" He said, "Oh, no." He said, no. He said, "No, I came here. I've only had a chance to meet George Bush 4 times." But that's what campaigning was like. There was more of a personal touch to it, and it's pretty hard now. The motorcades are huge. The press is, sequestered. The people are sequestered. It's a little different.
Very different. Very different.
So I'm curious, West Wing TV show. How real, how Hollywood, you guys were there.
So I loved that show. Just because it was fun. Nobody's running down the hallways of the West Wing in their shirt sleeves, sweating and screaming and all of that. The West Wing's a pretty staid place, but Craig's office was in the West Wing for 4 years, so you should answer that question.
Well, when I was out doing more speaking for quite a while, and that was the question most often asked, and I understand why. My feeling, I also liked the show. My feeling was exactly as Tom said. First of all, nobody was running in and out of the Oval Office. Nobody's running down the hall. The space is very small. The West Wing itself is not large, doesn't contain very many people. Most of the staff are in the executive office building, Eisenhower Executive Office building now. So it's the feel is different, and a lot of people who work there said, "Oh, it's not really that realistic." The realistic part, though, that I think is in some ways the most important, is that there's never an easy issue that comes to the President of the United States. The easy stuff all gets solved, even the difficult stuff gets solved in the cabinet departments and agencies that are executing policy and that sort of thing. So the issues that come to you as a staff to a president are really tough ones. And what the show captured, I think, was that you could be dealing with, a ship being sunk in the Strait of Hormuz at 10 o'clock, and at 11:30 you've got a shooting occurring someplace else, and then you've got unidentified aircraft someplace else, and then you've got congressional calls to make to get legislation passed. And so the pace of the inside of the White House is pretty intense. And honestly, for that reason, I can't really. I loved all 8 years. Now that I look back, I really did love it while I was doing it. But I think that's another change. I think the intensity is just tougher on people. I got asked when Dick Cheney's staff came in, they'd been there about 6 or 8 months, to come over and speak to them. They said, "Before you get into whatever you're going to say to us, how did you ever survive? We've only been here 6 months." But it's that intensity that the show captured, I think. The other part that it captured is you really, really have to budget time for the president to have thoughtful hours to reflect. One of the things Reagan did, which I thought was so smart, Mike Deaver really was the enforcer of it as head of his scheduled deputy chief of staff, was he took Wednesday afternoons off in quotes. Maybe he'd go horseback riding. Maybe he'd go read a book. Maybe he'd have people in to sit and talk. But he didn't have the press of a schedule where every 20 minutes there was something else happening. But I will say this, that Reagan did it differently than Bush. Bush did it differently than Clinton. Clinton differently than anybody. And so they all find their own way. But it's an intense place.
Yeah, it's intense. The hours are killing for the staff, which is why it's mostly a young person's game, and people who are unattached or have very understanding families. And it's stressful. It's stressful.
I had a fellow I met with who was a friend, a longtime friend, who led the American Retail Federation, who'd been in Lyndon Johnson's staff in the press office. And he was really nice, and we were in the transition. We hadn't yet taken office in '81. And he said, let me just tell you something. He said, you're going to head this cabinet affairs office. He said, all the issues, other than national security issues, they go someplace else. All the other issues flow through your office. And people are going to come to you, and they're going to argue their case, and eventually it's going to get decided. And the side that lost is going to be mad at you because they lost. The side that won is not going to be that happy because they think they should have gotten more and they should have gotten it faster. The people that will never forget the experience you give them are the people you walk into the Rose Garden or out to watch the helicopter take off or take into the East Room of the White House. And boy, that was the best advice I ever got, because you did a lot of things for a lot of different interest groups, or you worked with them or you heard their issues. They come and go. But I run into people to this day who say, I'll never forget the time you walked me into the Oval Office, or you walked me out to see the helicopters. That which is it does make it that part was rewarding, because you would see this through the other people's eyes, this special place you were working in. One more question, Mr. Bodor.
There's a couple instances in the book where either a president or a vice president departs the country under the utmost secrecy to show up in a war zone such as Afghanistan, taking extraordinary risk with press people, I think, involved, who were sworn to secrecy, and I think the book indicates that if any press person blew the cover, the trip was off. There must have been an awful lot of people on the staff who didn't want those kinds of trips to happen, and I'd be interested in if you could comment on that. And also, how in the world it was that in the couple of things you recite, nobody blew the cover, including the press. I think that's just absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, the one story you're referring to, I think, is written by the fellow who advanced or organized Bush 43's trip to Iraq for Thanksgiving, which was the first time in modern history that the president got into a war zone. Now, after that, there have been several visits, not just by him, but by Obama and others. And so they were writing a new script, basically, of how to do something. And the basic approach on something like that is the fewer people that know what's going on, the better, and the better odds you have of pulling it off. And so it's a very tight circle. And in that case, they knew they needed a press pool. They needed to tell the story, but the press was only going to be allowed to tell the story once they cleared the airspace coming back home. And so the president was in Crawford, so they pulled a few of the press pool in Crawford in to read them in, and they pulled a few people in Washington in to read them in. But when they did that, they took their phones, and they agreed, and it worked. And I think it's a great segue to the reality is that most people in that environment who choose to work in that environment presented that situation they want to make it work. You know, it's not an adversarial situation necessarily. It's you know, an opportunity to be part of something pretty special and to do your part. And so, yeah.
I might add, Dick, it's a great question, and of course, no reporter wants to be the one responsible for a trip like that getting canceled. And they're honorable in that regard. Two quick segues. One was, we briefed leadership before troops went into Grenada. And the troops were on the way. And one member of Congress felt that he had some pretty interesting information. He got on the phone and talked about it to a reporter. And the question was really asked, should we abort the mission? Which is interesting when you think about it, because I would bet, you know, it might be a presumption that it's the media we had the biggest problem with, was actually members of Congress. My last story, though, was President Bush, H.W. Bush, called, we're talking one day, and he said, look, well, let's go to that new restaurant, Red Sage. Don't you know the owner? And I said, yeah, in Washington, D.C. Guy out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I said, okay, got the date, we'll set it up. So I go to the guy who owns the restaurant, and I said, I've got a guest coming. I'll tell you who the guest is, but if it gets out that he's coming, he won't come. The guy looks at me, he knew my background, and I said, it's actually the president, Mrs. Bush, and 2 or 3 others of us. And he said, oh my gosh. And I said, but Mark, no one else can know. And because the Secret Service will treat this very lightly and won't interrupt what's going on as long as it's kept from people, doesn't get out. Because if the press finds out, they'll be swarming all over the place. So Mark says, okay. So evening arrives, we show up, he shows up in the limousine, we go to the restaurant, you walk downstairs, we walk over to our table, and there's something a little off. And pretty soon, President Bush says to me, "What? Who? The restaurant was full." He said, "Who are these people?" And I said, I don't know. None of them were looking at us. They were like averting their eyes. They wouldn't look over at the booth we were sitting in. I said, I'll go find out. So I go over to Mark, the owner, and I said, Mark, you've done a beautiful job. We're excited about the meal, and we're kind of halfway through it. And I said, but who are these people? He said, well, you told me nobody could find out. So I didn't want to risk it. I canceled all the reservations. These are all my family and friends. And I told them they couldn't look at you or walk up to the president. Which, of course, made the president feel very odd. And he got up and walked around and said a little... Shows you how good of an advance guy I am. Okay, we are, unless you'd like a final word, we are going to open the doors. You've been generous with your time. We didn't quite make the 2-hour mark. Generous with your time, and Tom's got a few books to sign. Thank you very much for coming out, and thank Tom Collamore.